It's a great honor to be here this morning and to be able to share this platform with eminent people who are sitting on both sides of me. I am, like my grandfather was, very concerned about what is happening today. And while we are talking about love thy neighbor, my grandfather always felt that it is part of every religious theory. Love thy neighbor is there in theory in every religious scripture, but it's not being practiced. And that is the problem with religion today, that we practice rituals instead of practicing the essence and the message of the religion. He was also very concerned, and I think he was perhaps in modern times the very first person to bring about interfaith dialogue. And it started about a century ago for him. He said that a friendly study of all the scriptures is the sacred duty of every individual. And he emphasized the word friendly because he said critical studies have been made dime a dozen, but we need to have a friendly study. And he made that friendly study of all the religions. He read the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran and the Hindu scriptures and Buddhist scriptures. And he found that none of them really had the whole truth, that every one of them had just a little fraction of the truth. And we hang on to that truth thinking that it is the whole truth, and therefore we have a very distorted vision of our own religion. And he realized that the only way we can come to understand all the religions of the world is if we all come together and have a dialogue here and talk about not only what are the good things in our religion, but focus on what are the bad things that are going on in the religion and how can we change those bad things into good things. He practiced his interfaith. He not only talked about it, but he practiced it. So we were born and we grew up in an interfaith family. Every morning and evening, his prayer services included hymns from every major religion of the world. We would sit in a neutral place like this auditorium without any religious symbols except for a little candle, and we would sing all the hymns from all the religions of the world. And that is what I was brought up in, and therefore I feel comfortable in a church, in a Hindu temple, in a mosque, in a synagogue, wherever I'm called upon to be. I don't see any divisions there because, again, like what my grandfather said, religion is like climbing a mountain. We are all going up to the same peak, so why should it matter to anybody which side of the mountain we choose to climb up? And so he practiced this and he respected all the religions. And he loved all the religions, and he said that we need to change and reform all of these religions, which brings me to what we have been just talking about, the definition of sinners and good people. I think when we begin to define people or to judge people and divide people in this manner, we are creating conflicts there. My grandfather refused during all his struggles against everybody, religious struggles as well as the political struggles. He refused to look at anybody as an enemy. He said, I don't have any enemies. I have friends who are misguided and I want to change them. So his focus on nonviolence was about changing and transforming the person. And that's also important for us to remember today because we are talking about peace and nonviolence. I had the opportunity of living with grandfather at the age of 12. I was sent to him to live in India. And I remember at the age of 13, I was coming back from school one day and I had a little pencil about 3 inches long, and I decided it was too small for me to use, and I threw it away because I was so sure that grandfather would give me a new pencil when I asked him for one. But that evening when I met grandfather and asked him for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small and where did I throw it away and why did I throw it away, and on and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, "You must be joking." I said, "You don't expect me to look for a little pencil in the dark?" He said, "Oh, yes, I do. He has a flashlight." And I must have spent about 2 hours searching for that pencil, and when I finally found it and brought it to him, he said, "Now I want you to sit here and learn 2 very important lessons. The first lesson is that even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources, and when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature." And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world, and because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty, and that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, things that we overconsume and throw away and destroy and waste and all of these things that we do are part of violence. It's an act of violence, either against nature or against human beings there. To make me understand this thoroughly, he made me draw a genealogical tree of violence, just as we would do a family tree, with violence as the grandparent and physical violence and passive violence as the 2 branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to analyze and examine everything that happened to me during the day, or things that I may have done to other people. All of that had to be analyzed and examined and put in their appropriate places on that tree. If it was the kind of violence where we use physical force against one another, all the fighting and kicking and beating and murders and rapes and wars and all of these things, that would go under physical violence. But if it's the kind of violence where we don't use any physical force and yet we hurt people, all the discrimination, hate, prejudice, looking down on people, classifying people and wasting resources, not being concerned about all the hungry people in the world, and the fighting and hundreds of things that we do, that would go under passive violence. When I began to do this introspection, I was amazed that within a few months I was able to fill up a whole wall in my room with acts of passive violence, not so much the physical violence. The physical violence had limitations, but the passive violence just grew endlessly. And that is when he explained to me the connection between the 2. He said, we commit passive violence all the time, every day, consciously and unconsciously, and that generates anger in the victim, and the victim then resorts to physical violence to get justice. So it is passive violence that fuels the fire of physical violence. So logically, if we want to put out that fire of physical violence, we have to cut off the fuel supply. And since the fuel supply comes from each one of us, we have to become the change that we wish to see in the world. We cannot create peace if we are not able to live in harmony. We cannot practice nonviolence if we don't understand the violence that we commit all the time. So it's essential that we understand all of these things and how they affect us, and how our relationships with each other are so corrupted by the materialistic lifestyle that we have chosen. It's made us so selfish and self-centered that we are thinking only about ourselves and not about our relationship with each other. I want to share with you one more story that my grandfather used to be very fond of telling us when we were growing up. It was about an ancient Indian king who once became very curious about the meaning of peace. And he invited all his intellectuals in his kingdom to come and explain the meaning of peace. And everybody came there and tried their best, but nobody could satisfy the king. And one day there was a intellectual from another town who was visiting, and the king asked him to explain the meaning of peace. And he said, the only person who can give you a satisfactory answer is an old sage who lives outside your kingdom. But he is so old that he cannot come to you. You will have to go to him and ask him this question. And so the next day the king went to this sage and asked him the meaning of peace. And the sage quietly went to the back of the house and got a grain of wheat and placed that grain of wheat on the king's palm and said, here is your answer. And of course the king didn't know what a grain of wheat had to do with peace, and he didn't want to show his ignorance. So he quietly clutched that grain of wheat and went back to his palace and placed that grain of wheat in a gold box. And every morning he would open the box to look for an answer, and he couldn't find any answers. So when this intellectual came back on a return visit, the king asked him to explain. That you sent me to the sage, he gave me this grain of wheat, and I don't know what the grain of wheat has to do with peace. So please explain. And that's when the intellectual said, it's very simple. He said, as long as you keep this grain of wheat in this box, nothing is going to happen. It will eventually rot and perish, and that will be the end of the story. But if you had allowed this grain of wheat to interact with all the elements, if you had planted this outside in the soil, it would sprout and grow, and very soon you could have a whole field of wheat. And that is the meaning of peace. That if we have found peace in our hearts, and if we keep it locked up for our own personal gains, it will perish with us. But if we let it interact with all the elements, it would sprout and grow, and very soon we could have a whole world of peacemakers. And that is the meaning of peace. And so I have come here this morning to give you the grain of wheat that I got from my grandfather. And I hope that you won't let it rot and perish, but let it interact so that all of us together can transform this world and make it a better place for future generations. Thank you.